Good evening, and thank you for attending this webinar. I'm Susan Hauser, serving as the president of the League of Women Voters of Alameda. Tonight's program is an informational one, not an advocacy forum. We are bringing the topic to you for your consideration. A few housekeeping items. Guests, microphones, and cameras are disabled. In other words, you won't be able to speak to or be seen by the group. However, there is a Q&A function on the screen. If you have a question, please type it in there and the panelists will do their best to respond. The program is being recorded and will be available after a few days on our website for people who wish to see it. We're honored tonight to have Preston Jordan with us to present information on Alameda's elections. A principal scientific engineering associate with the Energy Geosciences Division of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. In his spare time, he serves as a council member for the city of Albany. A co-founder of Voter Choice Albany, he will use data from Alameda's recent elections to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of our current plurality method, district elections, and ranked choice voting. Jordan says we first have to test different election methods against our goals for democracy. If research, data collection, and analysis show that a method other than the current one would be better to achieve those goals, the next step would be to develop that method in sufficient detail that it could be implemented and then get it implemented. Jordan will also discuss how the Alameda County Registrar of Voters is already set up to accommodate various election methods. So I'll hand the microphone over to our guest, Preston Jordan.
That problem. After a year, you'd think I'd have it down. Thank you very much, President Hauser, and it's a pleasure to be invited here by the League of Voters of Alameda. And I should have also included or said that I am also a League member. I'm a member of the Berkeley Albany Emeryville League, and I served on the board, I think, in 2015 to 2018 there. So I come with knowledge of what the League does, and I'm a passionate League member. So I'm here today, as was mentioned, to discuss election methods, both the current method and other potential methods that Alameda might choose to consider. Some disclaimers to start with. I don't know what election method is best for your city. As President Hauser said, this is not an advocacy piece. This is merely education, and hopefully will be thought-provoking for you. A lot of times we live in a system, we don't think about the system, but the method has a lot of aspects that control the kind of representation we get. So I'm hoping to raise that to consciousness for conscious thought. I don't know your city's politics, and I don't know your politics. I think it's part of the advantage of the League inviting an outsider in. So while it is not uncommon to view what follows as, well, will it advantage me or my political perspective or not? That's not the goal of what I'm presenting tonight. It's really just to think about the election methods for the city as a whole. So what is the purpose of an election? I'm not a political scientist. While I am a scientist, I am a geologist, not a political scientist, so I don't know the formal definition of the purpose of an election. Rather, like you, hopefully, as a voter, I have a voter's perspective, which is that if there's a group of voters, and we'll be using this motif throughout the rest of the presentation at various points. If there's a group of voters, and let's say 55% of them have an orange perspective, and 45% of them have a purple perspective, the purpose of an election method is to convert those perspectives to representation. So if you have a 5-member council, such as Alameda does, then the closest match in representation would be 3 members holding the purple perspective, and 2 of the council members holding I'm sorry, 3 members of the council holding the orange perspective and 2 members of the council holding the purple perspective. The election method is a way of translating the voters' perspectives into council perspectives. So as was mentioned by President Hauser, the starting point is determining what is it that you want an election method to do, what functions do you want it to have within your city. And there's a number of sources of possible problems that you would like it to solve or features that you would like it to have. These are 2 that we actually used in Albany. We went through this process in Albany. And between them, they list about 30 potential problems that election methods can be tested against. So one of them is called Behind the Ballot Box, Citizens Guide to Voting Systems. And the other one is a brochure from Vote regarding city council election methods. And from my understanding, the league looked at these lists of problems and then provided me with the ones that it thought were the most important for your city. And so I worked with those in constructing this presentation. The league identified 4 potential problems. Majority rule, which does not say the majority rule is a problem, but rather majority rule is a desired outcome. But not all methods provide that, as we'll see. Political minority representation. So this is, while the majority may rule, does the political minority get to have a voice at all in the legislative body? Does the governance match the voters' perspectives? So if voters hold the same perspective through time, does governance hold that same perspective through time, or does it shift? And then voter participation. How many eligible voters choose to actually cast votes in your local elections and participate in that fundamental of democracy? We'll start out with majority rule. So the next section will essentially test your current method, which is plurality at large, which means that the method where every voter can vote for as many candidates as there are seats, a single vote for each of those candidates, and the candidates who receive the most votes win. So we'll test the current method that you're using, which is also the method that Albany was using up until the last election, against these 4 criteria. So we'll start with majority rule. Are all possible council majorities elected by a majority of voters? So a council majority is obviously what's needed to pass policy. And so in order for you to have majority rule, any majority of the council needs to be supported by a majority of the voters. We'll start out with this plot. And so across the bottom are election years. You see the even number of years and the members of the city council that are elected in each year. You directly elect the mayor every 4 years, unlike in Albany, where I live, where the mayor is appointed by the council every year. And then you elect 2 council members every other year. On the vertical axis is the percent of the voters in support. So if we look at 2002, the mayor was elected with slightly less than 50% of the voters in support. This can occur when there are more than 2 candidates. Obviously, when you have more than 2 candidates, one candidate could have the most votes, but have fewer than 50% of the votes. We look at the election of mayor since then. We can see during this period, and this is the period for which data is available from the registrar online. So that's why I'm working with this study period. You can see that the mayor was elected with less than a majority voter support at least 3 times, and there's a 4th time that's right on the cusp. Honestly, I can't remember if it was just over or just under 50%, but very, very close. And so this is the average voter support for those 5 mayors, about 46%. So not a majority. Your mayors typically are not elected with majority support during this period. And here are all the council members. And so you can see that most council members are elected without majority support of the voters. And the average percentage of voters that participated in the election that supported a council member who was elected is about 42%. So if you put those together, mayor and council, you have the average level of support for individual members of the council at 44%. So the members of the council are not typically elected with majority support. And you have elections where none of the members were elected with majority support. So in 2004, you had an election where neither of the two council members gained majority support. 2010 and 12, you had two elections where neither the mayor nor any of the four council members reached majority support. And then since 2016, you have not elected a council member with majority support for 3 elections. And it's not over yet. Who knows what will happen in 2022. So I suspect this might be part of the reason I'm here talking today, that I was invited here, is because when this starts to happen more consistently, which is a provision of the method they use, it can start to lead to some concern about how things are going in terms of governance. So the current method that Alameda is using does not provide majority rule. What about political minority representation? Are political minorities represented? And I would imagine that's a question that brings to mind a lot for people. Again, I don't know your city. I don't know your past elections. I don't know who's been elected and who hasn't been elected. But a research group that I work with of Alamedans finally put together this map. And so to spend a little bit to explain this map. So this shows the precincts in Alameda, the voting precincts in 2016 and 2018 elections. This does not show 2020 because in 2020, the registrar consolidated the precincts. So there were far fewer precincts in 2020. And that was because they wanted to run fewer polling places because of the pandemic. Not as many poll workers, not as many people anticipated to vote in person. So the 2020 data doesn't provide the same geographic discrimination as the earlier data because the precincts were so much larger. So focusing on 2016 and 2018, what this map is showing is the number of candidates that made it onto the council that were supported in each precinct across those 2 elections. So the maximum is 5. If a precinct had voted top for all 5 of the council members, then the number would be 5. And then you can see there's the number 4, which is a slightly lighter blue, and the very light blue is 3. And then white is 1 and 2. Pardon me. You can see the level of representation that's gained by each precinct varies dramatically. There's an area down here on Harbor Bay where right across the street, the residents of this precinct only voted top 1 of the 5 council members of the 2018 to 2020 council. And then on the other side of the street, that precinct voted top all 5. So there's a great contrast in representation between those 2 precincts. These voters, at least the ones that voted for those council members who won, which would be the council members who had the most votes in that precinct, are essentially represented by 5 council members. And the voters in this precinct are represented by 1 council member. Someone can ask, is that reasonable? When you think about our elections to state assembly and senate, and you think about our elections to the federal House of Representatives, we are each represented by 1 member. Now, maybe you didn't vote for that member, but at least the plurality of, or majority, depending on the type of election, of people in the district did vote for that member. And so in that sense, the representation is uniform across the state. In this case, in using this method, you have extreme winners and some pretty extreme losers. And so to the extent that voters in this area, in these 3 precincts, are clustered and all had far less representation than the other precincts, they're not gaining the benefit of representation the same way that the other precincts are. So in that sense, I I'm not saying that that area represents a political minority. I, again, have no idea. But it does mean that there does seem to be some cohesive view in this area that is not the same as much of the rest of Alameda that is not being represented. Why? I think it's useful to consider the league's position on representation for political minorities. And so this is the position that was adopted at the National Convention in 2020. And so I've highlighted and emphasized a portion of it. The league supports electoral systems that elect policymaking bodies that proportionally reflect the people they represent. This tears off of, you may be aware of, I think it was James Madison who wrote that the legislature should be a copy and miniature of the body politic of the voters, so that the actions taken by the legislature are informed by and reflect the perspectives of the voters. Again, I don't know your city, but I did look this up because I think it's germane. So this is obviously you have nonpartisan elections, which is a requirement in municipal elections in California. But I think it is worth putting this forward because I would imagine, given this number that 62% of voters that are registered in Alameda are Democrats, that probably a lot of the council members are Democrats, if not all of them. And so it's worth looking at the California Democratic Party position as well regarding election methods. And that position is to encourage the replacement of at-large election methods, such as plurality at large, with by district and/or alternative voting methods, such as ranked choice voting. And there's a couple other methods, cumulative voting, limited voting, which I will not be discussing, but people can certainly ask about, to ensure that the voters of diverse communities are not diluted. Meaning that in plurality at large, if the dominant group in the city, whatever it is, if all those voters vote the same way, they can preclude representation for any other group completely. So I don't know why the Democratic Party adopted this, but I would imagine it's for that reason, because it recognizes it's a matter of fairness. All groups should have representation on the legislative body in the strength that they are comprised part of the electorate. So plurality at large does not provide political minority representation consistently. Stability of governance. Does the governance match the voters? Does the strength of views on the council match those of the voters? So we go back to this 55-45 split among a hypothetical electorate, and two candidates run to represent each perspective. Under plurality at large, the two candidates that are seeking to represent the perspective held by the majority of voters will win. That happens across two elections, and then obviously the mayor is going to be elected on the majority perspective as well. You can end up with a council that only has the majority perspective and does not have the political minority perspective voice at all. What that can result in is that the, let's say, debates in the community that are going on politically may not be reflected on the council. The council is all just heading off in unison one direction, while the community is left more and more up in arms having this political debate. And the way I tend to think of it in Albany, at least, is that I want to outsource those debates to the council to some extent. I want them to be having the debate so I can, just go have a beer or coffee with my neighbors and not worry about that part so much. But this kind of result tends to invert that, so that the voters and the residents end up having the debate sort of a much higher level perhaps than the council itself does. If you take that hypothetical electorate again, and you have four candidates who are running to represent the orange perspective, you can get the opposite result. You can get the purple perspective, even though it is a political minority, gaining both seats. And if that happens over two elections, and then also happens with the mayor, which is possible, if you have one candidate running for the purple perspective and multiple candidates running for the orange perspective, You can get an unfair council that only represents the political minority. So you can have diametrically opposed outcomes based on the number of candidates that are running to represent the different perspectives, even though the electorate is exactly the same. So that creates the possibility of instability in governance. In order for government to get anything done in a policy domain, it often takes more than 2 years. And so if the voters have a stable perspective, the council needs to have that reflect that stable perspective in order to be able to move policy and move the city in that direction. So plurality at large does not provide governance that matches the voters, and therefore introduces what I would say is an artificial instability in the system. Voter participation. What portion of eligible voters vote in Alameda's elections? So here again, we have the election years across the bottom and percent of eligible voters participating in the vertical axis. And so these are the non-presidential election years, the gubernatorial elections. And the percent of eligible voters participating is under 50%. That 50% is only a magic number in this domain, but it's under 50%. It's about 46%. And then looking at the presidential election years, it's about 62%. And so when you put those together, you get about 54% of the eligible voters who are actually casting a vote in Alameda's elections. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean they're marking just the president or the governor race on the ballot. This means we're actually marking the ballot for Alameda's elections. And that's really, I would say, the germane metric with regard to civic participation at a minimum for your democracy. So I would characterize the voter participation in Alameda as low. Certainly it is lower in some other cities. Certainly it is higher in some other cities. I'm fortunate to live in a city where voter participation is about a little bit under 80% of eligible voters cast votes in Albany's election. So even though we're used to, I think as Americans, to some extent, having voter participation in the 50% area, I'm thinking that's reasonable. It doesn't have to be that way. Here I've listed the criteria or / problems down the left side, and I'm going to list election methods across the top. So we've been discussing plurality at large, which is the existing method. And this is essentially a rubric to help organize thinking so that you can be potentially a little more objective, a little more insightful about comparing different election methods and discerning which ones might provide more of what you want and less of what you don't want. So we've talked about plurality at large, and I'm going to use red to indicate not really providing good results against each of these criteria. We've been through that. So the next method I'll talk about is plurality by district. So the larger cities, you're probably aware, are divided into single member districts. And so that is an option. Most cities that are divided into districts don't actually require a majority. Some do, and they might use 2-round runoff. Like I think Los Angeles uses 2-round runoff. But if you look at plurality by district, it's a little bit more likely to result in majority rule because it's harder for a small group of voters to control all the seats in district elections than it is in the at-large election. The at-large election, as I described, if you have the largest grouping of voters all voting for the same slate of candidates, then they can win all the seats. Whereas in plurality by district, it's more likely that at least some of those districts are going to go to a majority supported candidate. Political minority representation. This kind of runs the gamut. So you get a feel for the color spectrum I'm using here. Green is approaching meeting that criteria. Whether or not plurality by district provides political minority representation really depends on the geography of your city. If you have a strong correlation between political perspectives and different parts of the city, then dividing into districts can provide political minority representation. On the other hand, if you have political perspectives that are sort of uniformly intermixed throughout the city, then districts aren't really going to provide that. Another area where districts can be quite helpful is if you have a strong difference in turnout across the city. So if you have far fewer eligible voters participating in one area than another area, if you go to districts that area that has not as many or not as high a percentage of eligible voters participating can still get representation. And I would say there's value judgments around whether areas where the voters don't participate as strongly should get the advantage of a district, and I will leave that to you all to discuss amongst yourselves at some point which you think is the right answer. Governance stability. It'll probably be a bit more stable again because you've got a bit more likelihood, probability of majority rule or at least majority support for some of the council members. I put a question mark here though, because as you might have seen by now, I'm somewhat data driven, or I at least try to be, bring my science practice into my civic practice. And this isn't a question that's very easy to get at with data that's currently available, at least that I'm aware of. So that's why I have a question mark there. That's really more of a hypothesis, I would say, than something that is supported in data. And the voter participation, I did look at cities that have electorates the same size as Alameda across the state. And when I say electorates the same size, I mean, I looked at cities that had the same number of participating voters in absolute numbers as Alameda going back many elections. There's a great database of municipal election results maintained at an institute in Sacramento State University using funding or on funding from the Secretary of State. You can download these Excel spreadsheets that are incredible. They've got the results for all the cities in the entire state every election. And so I could look to that to get a feel for cities that were the same size as Alameda in terms of the size of its number of participating voters. Did it have higher or lower participation percentage as a percent of all potential eligible voters? And there was really no difference between plurality at large and plurality by district in a statistical sense. So it appeared that going from plurality at large to plurality by district would not be associated with an increase in voter participation. Now, as mentioned, considering majority rule with plurality by district, when you have plurality by district, the candidates are not required to be supported by a majority of the voters in order to gain office. There were a number of cities in the Bay Area, you're probably aware, that used to have 2-round elections. So they would have essentially a primary and then a runoff if needed. So Oakland had its primary with the state primary in June. And if no candidate garnered a majority voter support, then they would have their runoff at the general election. Berkeley had its primary with the general election, and then if it needed a runoff, it held its runoffs in February. And so that's one way to get at majority rule. The problem with that is one or the other of those elections typically had far fewer participating voters than the other one. And a candidate could actually win with that far fewer voters turning out, which is not a great outcome. It also was expensive. So those cities were motivated to save money by going to ranked choice. And so I'm going to play a video now describing what ranked choice voting is. It's essentially a series of runoff elections. And let's see if this works. So I guess I'll go ahead and try to explain. So ranked choice voting is a series of runoff elections. So you can just imagine that you have an election and no candidate gains a majority of voter support. And so then you have another election and you eliminate the candidate who had the least support. And everybody goes back to the polls and they vote again. And no candidate gets majority support. And you eliminate the candidate who gets the least support. And you go back to the polls and you do it again until a candidate emerges who has majority support. Well, rather than go back to the polls over and over and over again, which is not really feasible, you provide the information up front of how you would vote if your favored candidate in that round, or in the previous round, got eliminated, what would you do? Who would you vote for? Well, you provide that information to the registrar up front. And so with that information, the registrar is able to run a series of runoff elections without you having to go to the poll over and over and over again. So it's a way to get to a majority winner. And I'll go back to slides. It's a way to get to a majority winner without having to go to the polls over and over again. So it's an efficient means. It saves the voters time. It actually saves the candidates quite a bit of hassle, because for a candidate, for instance, in Oakland, as I described, a candidate would run in June, and then if no candidate got a majority voter support, they would have to campaign for another 5 months, which has a number of potentially deleterious effects. So ranked choice gets you to majority support in one election. And so we see now, we see I've colored this going from orange to green. Now, the reason that isn't all green is because it is possible for each candidate to be elected with majority support in a district, but decisions taken by the council be taken by candidates who do not have a majority support of the city. So it's a little bit complicated, but in Alameda, you would have 4 districts, and you need 3 council members to adopt a policy. So if you had 3 council members who were elected from districts that adopted a policy, and each of them was elected with 50% support, they're being elected with 50% support from 3/4 of the city. It's only half the support of 3/4 of the city, which is less than 50% of the voters. So if you go to ranked choice by district, you can still have decisions that are taken by candidates who were elected by less than the majority of the city. So that's why, it's still possible to have less than majority rule. It's less likely than by district, because every candidate at least has to get majority support from the district, unlike in plurality when they can win without majority support from the district. Going on a political minority representation, there's all sorts of different types of representation that political scientists consider. These are some of the types. There can be political representation. So to be, your classic, you've got multiple political parties, and is the party that is in the minority actually have a chance of getting a seat to get represented. You have policy representation. This might be otherwise framed as ideological representation. So more germane to nonpartisan or notionally nonpartisan municipal elections. Geographic representation. It's representation where different parts of cities would have representation on the council. And descriptive representation, which political scientists define as representation for people who vote based on their demographics or their identity. So I'm going to look at some Alameda results relative to descriptive representation. This is not meant to highlight that as the most important form of representation, but rather because it is data that is collected and readily available, so easiest to access and analyze. So if we look at ranked choice voting, the percentage of elections that are won by women. This is an academic paper that came out in 2018. And what they did is they looked at cities that transitioned from plurality district elections to ranked choice voting elections by district. And they looked at cities that over the same time period that stayed as plurality elections to see if there was a difference. So in the control cities, which are the cities that stayed with plurality, in the first half of the study period, 40% of the elections were won by women. And after, in the second period, which is when the other cities went to ranked choice, a bit less than 30% of the elections were won by women. And what they call the treatment cities, which are the cities that went to ranked choice, again, 40%. of the elections were won by women before going to ranked choice, and afterwards about 45% were won by women. And they controlled for, this is a multivariate analysis. They controlled for all sorts of variables in doing this. And so what you get is a difference that's significant for those who are statistically inclined at a p less than 0.1. You get a difference between the percent of women that are elected under the different systems or the different methods. Looking at elections that are won by women of color, again before the transition to ranked choice, in that earlier period, it was about 20% of elections that were won by women of color in both the cities that made the transition and the cities that didn't. And afterwards, it was only about 7% in the cities that stayed with plurality and 22% in the cities that went to ranked choice. Again, that was significant to the p less than 0.1. So if we look at that, we can see that the ranked choice is doing better in terms of political minority representation. Now, again, this is descriptive representation. I want to be clear because that's data that's more readily available. And so it does better than the plurality methods. That's what the results show. We can discuss cause and effect, but it's just looking at what actually happened on the ground. And so I've given that a orange to green rating. So you're moving up towards better political representation. The reason it's orange is because it still is a majoritarian system. So in any particular district, the candidate who's supported by a majority gets elected. And so if you have the same majority in every district in your city and the same political minority in every district in your city, then you still can end up with a political minority not represented. But it does at least move in the direction as based on results from real elections. Governance stability, you will have more stability in your governance because unless the majority in the district changes, the policy perspective of the candidate that is elected over time will not change. So you will have stability in terms of the policy direction of your city, unless the electorate's perspective changes, which of course, if that happens, then an election method should result in a difference of policy or a shift in policy held by the council members. Voter participation. So this is looking at undervote. And so for this, I went back to that data set that was available from the state to compare cities before and after transition to ranked choice. And so we have before, so we have Alameda, and so specifically I looked at Alameda in this case. So we have Alameda staying plurality, and it has an undervote of about 12%. And describe what undervote is. So undervote, as I mentioned earlier, if a voter marks the ballot for, say, the presidential election and then turns it in, and they don't mark anything else, that is termed by the registrar an undervote for all the other elections that are on that ballot. So these are voters who actually bothered to turn in a ballot, but they didn't bother to mark that particular election. So you can see in this time period across Alameda's elections, of the voters who actually turned in a ballot, about 10 to 12% chose not to mark Alameda's election. So they did not participate in Alameda's elections. And if I look at a city with an electorate of similar size, it had an undervote before it went to ranked choice voting of about 18%. And after it went to ranked choice voting, it had an undervote of about 10%. So while it ended up the same place as Alameda, it started from a worse place from my perspective in terms of functioning of democracy. And so this suggests that going to ranked choice will result in a decrease in the undervote. In other words, more of the voters who turn in a ballot will choose to vote in the local races. And again, this is just the phenomenon. We can talk about cause and effect in the question session if you want. So that suggests that voter participation is going to go up While I only compared those two cities, I've done this for a number of cities, grouping cities together and whatnot, and it's a fairly consistent outcome. So it's not specific just to that comparison of those two cities. Now, if we go to ranked choice at large, so this is applying ranked choice citywide to elect those two council members, and then obviously whether you're by district or at large, you would be electing directly electing the mayor by ranked choice should that method be adopted. In that case, going back to this schematic, if you have a 55-45% split, because of how ranked choice at large works, you will elect one candidate to represent each perspective. And then, of course, the mayor will be elected by the majority. You'll end up with a 3-2 council, which is as accurate a representation of the electorate's perspectives as you can get with a 5-member council and that particular electorate. And if you have more candidates running to represent the majority perspective, it doesn't end up causing the political minority perspective to end up with 100% of the representation. You get the same outcome of a 3-2 split in perspective on the council, with the majority perspective having the majority of the seats. And so in that sense, you actually do get majority rule. Any 3 council members who vote for a policy will have been elected by a majority of voters citywide. So ranked choice voting at large gives you solid majority rule. In terms of political representation, this again can vary. And so I've actually inverted the color scheme here relative to ranked choice by district. So what that means is that situations where ranked choice by district gives you strong political minority representation can actually be a situation where ranked choice at large gives the political minority less representation. And why is that? That's because of differences in turnout. Again, if you go back to if you have the voters in some area who participate at a much lower rate than another area, then ranked choice at large is not going to compensate for that, whereas ranked choice by districts will. So this really comes down to an analysis of your city and what your goals are, what your values are relative to variances in turnout across the city, which method would provide better political minority representation. Governance stability, as shown in the graphic about majority rule. You will have governance stability in the sense that the policy direction of the government matches the electorate. And for voter participation, there's consensus among political scientists that proportional representation has far higher percentage of voters that will participate. This is true at the national level, and study after study after study. It's pretty easy to find these statistics as well for yourself, that nations that use proportional representation have a much higher voter participation than nations that don't. But the one example I could find at the municipal level was a study of Cambridge, which uses proportional ranked choice voting, another name for ranked choice at large. It has been doing so since 1941, and it compared the voter participation in Cambridge to 3 nearby cities of similar demographics, plus or minus. And what was seen is that while they had somewhat similar voter participation in the 60s, they then diverged through time. As happened throughout the nation, the voter participation declined going into the 80s. But in Cambridge, it didn't decline as much as in the other 3 cities. So it being proportional ranked choice was correlated with not a steep decline in voter participation. Now, this is just one case. I can't claim that this is necessarily statistically significant. I didn't actually run the numbers on this to run the test to determine if it would be significant. But in the US, the only city that uses proportional ranked choice is Cambridge. There were about 20 other cities that used it, but it got wiped out last century by the political elite because it had defrayed their power. So voter participation, ranked choice at large will give you the highest voter participation. That's a proportional representation method. I'm not putting this dark green because I don't, dark green to me is what you see in some Scandinavian countries where you get 90% or so voter participation. I don't want to misrepresent that ranked choice at large would get you that far. It's not all about the election. There's other factors obviously that go into whether voters choose to participate or not. And so that the main distinction for ranked choice by district versus ranked choice at large in terms of uncertainty in question and further analysis and choosing your values is really around this political minority representation portion. So that's the only one where ranked choice at large of these four could perform worse than ranked choice by district. So if you're interested in ranked choice, that would be perhaps the next step that you want to go through in terms of analysis. And so with that, I've spoken for a while and made some messes with the video there. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, I guess, and we can go to questions and answers. Thanks very much.
My name is Karen Butter, and I'm chair of the League's Action Committee, and I'm here to ask questions of Preston. And I want to remind everybody that you can submit your questions through the Q&A button. I recognize that Preston has presented a tremendous amount of data that's a little bit hard to put together in a very short amount of time. So I recognize that it may be hard for some people to capture all of the points that you were making. I do want to emphasize that we are recording this, so you'll have an opportunity to go back and look at it again and listen to those parts that were not totally clear. One question that we had, Preston, is can you make available the URL for the video that you couldn't show? Or if you can send it to us, we can send it out because it looked like it would be very useful for people to understand actually how ranked choice voting does work. So we'll get it from you and make sure that people can see it. So
absolutely, yeah, and I apologize for that.
Well, that happens, you can't always anticipate all of the issues with Zoom, even though we're pretty Zoom savvy after more than a year. So the first question that I have for you is undervote related to people's feelings on whether the vote counts? She's not sure how that could or has been surveyed. So could you go over undervote a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in general, what the leading hypothesis in political science research is, and bear with me because it's political science, so it uses terms that might not make sense to us colloquially on face value, how they define them. But in political science, a wasted vote is defined as a vote that does not actually elect somebody. Now, that's not how we tend to think of wasted votes. We tend to think if you go to the polls or if you submit a ballot, let's say, because we're not going to the polls so much anymore, then you have voted and your vote's not wasted, your vote counts. But what political scientists look at, well, if you vote and your vote doesn't actually result in representation, then it's a wasted vote because it doesn't matter if you went to the polls or if you submitted a ballot or not. And so in that regard, methods that result in a higher percentage of the voters actually getting representation motivate people to actually vote. And I would say it's a rational calculation on people's part. Why spend the time, all the energy that it takes to vote, not just the act, but the intellectual power of discerning and learning about candidates and then voting, if over and over again, the candidate you support doesn't get elected? At some point, you're going to say, why am I doing this? I've got other things I can do with my time. So that's generally the leading hypothesis with some support behind it, that voters are actually making a rational calculation on, is my vote actually going to have an impact and convert to representation?
So the next question is about voting in San Francisco, and the questioner asked that did not voting by district lead to inter-district infighting in San Francisco, leading to the deaths of Harvey Milk and George Moscone by Dan White, and then SF quit using by district. So do you have some thoughts about the San Francisco situation?
Yeah, so interestingly, San Francisco voted to go back to district elections, and I can't speak to the politics of why they did that, but they voted to go back to district elections with the first district election of the current series of district elections occurring in the year 2000. And when it went back to district elections, it was not using ranked choice voting, so it had a 2-round runoff. Its primary election, not really a primary because the candidate got majority support, then they were elected, but its primary election was with the general election in November. It had its runoff election in mid-December. So not very much long after that, and terrible timing, so that the voter participation would just plummet and the character of the electorate would change dramatically. There were instances where candidates won the runoff with fewer votes than another candidate had in the primary, which is a pretty wacky outcome. So I think that was part of the motivation for going to ranked choice. I mean, as I said, expense, saving money was the biggest motivation. But avoiding those kinds of outcomes was another part of the motivation. So in that sense, I can't speak to why San Francisco voters chose to go back to district voting, but it was unrelated to ranked choice as a choice initially.
Okay, we're going to move on to talking about finances and what are the ongoing financial ramifications in running district elections? And then the same question for ranked choice voting. And obviously you've got some experience from Albany as well as other research that might be available.
Yeah. The situation of cost with district elections is actually just changed. So the state has passed a law that requires a much more interactive, I would say, in terms of public input process for drawing district lines. And from what I've seen from other cities that have engaged in this process previous to it being a mandate on all cities that use districts, it can run, I don't know, plus or minus, it's $100,000, it might be 70, it might be $150,000. Now that's only going to be every 10 years. So you can decide, what kind of a hit that is for your budget. The larger issue potentially that can come up is the contention around it. So Berkeley uses district elections, and I know Berkeley's not Alameda, and Berkeley's got its own kind of hothouse politics. So I'm not saying this would happen in Alameda.
Right.
But Berkeley, when it drew district lines in the early 80s, it specifically drew district lines to split student voters. So it wanted to divide the student voters up among a bunch of different districts so that they couldn't elect somebody or reduce the chance of the students electing somebody. And then it passed a charter amendment that basically hardwired those lines in perpetuity. Well, the students figured this out along with some of their political allies and started, expressing displeasure, let's say, to put it, well, it was displeasure. It was reasonably reasonable the way they did it. First in 2000, and I can't remember the details on that, but then again, it didn't get solved then. It went to 2010. It turned into such contention that 2 of the council members ran a referendum and got it qualified after the district lines were adopted. So that nullified the district lines. And at that time, the district lines had been redrawn by the majority to actually create the student district. So you start to see the problems with districts here. It's like, well, you're going to choose winners and losers. No matter how you draw it, you're choosing winners and losers just by the act of drawing the lines. And the way out that Berkeley finally found, or the council majority found, if you can believe this, was the city sued itself. And the city sued itself in order to have a judge impose the district lines that the majority had already adopted on the city for the election. So you can imagine the expense of that. I don't know what all the expense of that is. I mean, there's both the hard expense of the dollars and cents. There's also the expense of creating, tremendous political animus in the city. Did I answer the question? Oh, okay, that's part of the question. The other part was the cost of ranked choice. So, for cities that had 2-round elections, it saves money, but it doesn't save the entire cost of one of the elections. So the registrar charges an extra bit of money per voter for ranked choice elections because the ballot card is longer and or there's a second ballot card, there's more processing involved. And so I don't remember the exact numbers, but for Albany, which has about 10,000 regularly participating voters, the estimate was, I guess you remember the numbers, the estimate was it would be an extra $30,000 per election. So about an extra $3 per voter. And the cost without ranked choice, just to give you kind of a baseline, that the registrar charges is about $5 or $6 per voter. So it'll increase the cost of the election by, I don't know, about half. Again, though, you can decide for yourself whether that is an important hit to your budget or not. For Albany, that extra $30,000 comes out of a budget of $24 million a year. So from my perspective, that's worth it for the democratic improvement. For your perspective, you may come to a different conclusion.
What cities are using in the Bay Area are using ranked choice voting?
So currently it is, so San Francisco started using it in 2004 after passing it, I think in 2002. And then San Leandro, Berkeley, and Oakland started using it in 2010. And that actually is a great advantage to us being both Albany and Alameda, because we're in Alameda County. And so because those cities forged the path, the registrar has the equipment, the software, the hardware to do it. So we're not in a situation where as individual smaller cities, we have to actually foot that bill, which in all likelihood we never would. We just wouldn't even choose to use it. But because the larger cities have done it, we have the opportunity to piggyback.
Mm-hmm. The next question is one I've heard quite a bit about, concern about going to districts. So when the city council members are elected by districts, that can lead to the council member decision making affecting just issues in that district and not the whole city. And we at times we have a pretty contentious council in terms of decision making. So it would seem like going to districts would make it even more contentious. And so what's your perspective on that?
So yeah, I've read a lot of news articles about cities that have gone from at-large to districts, and that concern is raised a lot. The only actual study I've seen that bears on that, so there's a lot of hypothesizing, I would say, but the only study I've seen that really bears on that with actual research was an interesting study that looked at what happened with housing generation and housing policy in cities that made this transition from at-large to by district. And what they found was less housing generation. So fewer new residences were built once the city went to by district as compared to cities that stayed at large. Now they had hypotheses in the paper for why that was. The hypothesis was that, well, when you have council members who are the sole representative for a smaller portion of the city than the whole city, then they will, essentially fight not to have new housing built in their area. And the other council members are generally averse to going against them, because if they go against that council member, then tit for tat, when the tables are turned, they're going to have somebody who doesn't support them. So it reduces housing production. So that's the only paper I've seen that really looked at this academically and with data. And so in that sense, I guess you could say it lends some support to the sort of prevailing conventional wisdom. I haven't seen any other research on how it affects other policy outcomes, though. But that's what I can offer.
Mm-hmm. So this is a real simple question. Why is election reform so difficult to achieve?
Yeah, so in Albany, I started, so I haven't said much about Albany. So in Albany, we passed a measure last election to go to ranked choice at large. We used plurality at large to elect our 5-member council. And I started working on that in 2008. It took 12 years to get it on the ballot. There was a council majority of 3 that I would say refused to put it on the ballot. We even had 2 unanimous requests from our school board to put it on the ballot, because our school board is under our charter. The school district and the city are one and the same in terms of their geographic extent. And the city council majority refused to put on the ballot, even in the face of a unanimous request from the school board, which to my knowledge is the first time that's ever happened. I mean, usually our council, well, always our council would put whatever on the ballot the school board asked for, even if it went on to sign the ballot argument against. But as a matter of just sort of professional courtesy of co-equal agencies, we'd say, okay, fine, we'll put it on the ballot. We don't agree, but we'll put it on the ballot. And only the city council has the authority to put charter amendments on the ballot. But the school board had to ask the city council. So you see, there was great resistance. We eventually went to an initiative and got it on the ballot that way. And it passed with 73% voter support. So clearly it was something the voters wanted, but the majority of the council didn't want. And so why is that? I would guess it's because those who were elected under one method, well, they succeeded under that method. So why would they want to change?
Right.
Not to their advantage. And they have tremendous authority, so they can block it. So to me, it's an issue like redistricting. The choice of election method should not be under the control of the elected body. It should be under the control exclusively of an independent citizens committee. The same way the league supports redistricting being, under an independent committee. It's an inherent conflict of interest. It's just it's like the most fundamental conflict of interest you can imagine. And so, it's something hopefully the league will take up in 10 or 20 years. Once we succeed on the redistricting, getting independent redistricting commissions across the country, as we can get an independent election method commissions across the country that would have the authority to put measures directly on the ballot for the voters to weigh in on and just bypass the elected officials.
Right. It would seem that in district elections, it would be easier for candidates to run for office because the cost for an individual candidate would be much less in running for a smaller district rather than trying to run, across a whole city. And I would think that bears out in your data from Albany and in your running for office.
Yeah, and so certainly the cost would be less. Hard to debate that. I mean, I don't have actual data, but just having run for office myself, just the sheer mechanics of how many households you want to cover. I would say what we found in Albany, so in choosing to pursue ranked choice at large rather than going to the districts, is that for a city with an electorate the size of Albany's, looking at other cities the same size as Albany that went from at-large to district, we saw a substantial, meaning large, and significant, meaning statistically meaningful increase in the number of uncontested elections. So in other words, elections where there were the same number of candidates as seats available, or actually fewer candidates than seats available. And so for that reason, we chose to go to ranked choice at large because we didn't want to have an uncontested election increase. There's some debate about, well, if we went to districts, would that do a better job representing political minorities in the city? And so, this is a great example of trading off, which value are you going to prioritize? You're going to prioritize political minority representation, you're going to prioritize having contested elections. And I co-founded a group called Voter Choice Albany, and it prioritized, we don't want uncontested elections, we want to minimize that. I actually did look at the same thing, so kind of to reveal a little bit, the league did hand me as the fifth problem, which I didn't discuss, whether or not elections are contested, and I looked at that for Alameda, and I expected to see the same effect at cities the size of Alameda as Albany. And so I went back to that database in Sacramento State that I talked about and ran all the numbers, found comparator cities. And to my surprise, there was no change. There was no uptick in the portion of elections that were uncontested when those cities went from at-large to by district. So in that sense, you don't have to decide on that trade-off, between political minority representation as it correlates to geography versus contested elections. You're in a better position than Albany because you don't have to decide on that trade-off.
So another question, Preston, how does this transition occur? Does does the council vote to change to ranked choice voting? Or is there a resolution for citizens to vote on? And I think you kind of already alluded to that in a prior answer. And does it require more than a majority? So, and we're a charter city, and is Albany a charter city as well?
Yeah, Albany is our charter city, and so that's another advantage that Alameda has, is the only charter cities in California have the power to do this. And in Albany, our charter actually reserves to ordinance the choice of election method. So we didn't have to amend our charter. Our charter says, unless otherwise by adopted ordinance, the method will be by the state government code. And so that's why we were using plurality at large. It wasn't defined in our charter, it was just defaulting to the state government code. But because we had that provision, we could adopt a local charter, a local ordinance to change our election method. So in Albany, the council actually could have changed the election method by adopting an ordinance, which does not require a vote. Voter Choice Albany, we didn't want that. It's too serious an issue to just have it done by ordinance. So the council, we got the ordinance, qualified it as an initiative. The council could have adopted it. It's something people don't know, but when you qualify an initiative, if it's an ordinance, the council can just adopt it. They don't have to put it on the ballot. Not that our council would have adopted it, but we definitely didn't want them to adopt it. We wanted them to put it on the ballot because we're like, this is something everybody needs to weigh in on. So you would have to look at your own charter to determine whether you need to amend the charter or if you have that reservation of power via an ordinance.
And how long did it take you?
Well, I'm not sure how long it took me then.
I mean, the number of years to actually make the change.
Well, so make the change. I mean, there are so many different dimensions to that. So I would say once the initiative is passed, the initiative requires using ranked choice at large in 2022. And well, it's to say it requires that unless the registrar is not able to administer it. So we didn't want to, we carefully chose not to put the city in the position of having to run its own elections, which would be very expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Now we knew at the time that the registrar could run this method, but nonetheless, we wanted to give the city that safeguard. So it says 2022. So once it was adopted by the voters, the immediate next election. I don't know if that was the dimension that question was going to, or sort of the whole history of initiative.
Well, I was talking about getting the initiative on how long did it take to get the initiative on the ballot, and then for the vote to actually happen.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I would say the run up to the initiative, as I said, I started working on this in 2008. Albany has a standing charter review committee, and I was a member of that committee. And so that committee studied election methods using a similar rubric that I described, the criteria down this side, election methods across the top, doing the research for 3 years. And then made a recommendation to the council that actually took a number of years for reasons I won't go into. And so that sort of socialized knowledge about this. So I'm putting that in there because we didn't just go straight to initiative. It's possible to go straight to initiative, but we had this history of working on it. When we finally decided to go to an initiative was, I think in January of 2020. We hired a lawyer because we had to get this thing written right. We weren't going to do it as a bunch of amateurs because it's that important. We hired a lawyer, wrote up the measure ordinance, and started circulating it in late February of 2020. And you can see what's coming here. Started collecting signatures, and it was wildly popular. I mean, I went door to door. We did door to door, by the way. We don't have a place in Albany that's like a major place that lots of people go. So by and large, we did door to door, and that's sort of how politicking works in Albany. And I would say 7 out of 10 doors that opened, at least one person signed the initiative. So kind of right out the gate, and that ended up being how much it passed by. We needed to get well, we got half the number of signatures that we needed within a month. And we had, on our own timeline, we had 3 months to get it done. So generally, when you're qualifying an issue, you want to get at least 50% more signatures than you need,
Right.
because invalidation rate. So I'm not representing that we got half the ballot signatures we needed, but we got a number of signatures that was equal to half the total ballot signatures we needed. So we were, we were in great shape. Usually initiative signature gathering processes start slow and build up steam with time. So right out the gate, we were doing fantastically.
So let me interrupt you. So
Sure.
the point that I think you were trying to make and I was trying to make is that this does not happen overnight.
Oh, yeah.
It's a long process. And
Yeah, yeah.
unless the city council would say, yeah, we bless it and we're going to vote for it. But it's a process to get this through.
Yeah.
And the process you describe is one that, we're all familiar with when we're trying to get, make change, and particularly with elections.
I would almost say the larger the city, the faster it can go, which is, now that I think about it, which is kind of contradicts conventional wisdom. I can hypothesize why that is, but I think, there's more sort of civic capital in terms of political organizations and coalitions in larger cities than there is in smaller cities. And so I think there's a mechanism by which entities that have a lot of members can sign on to something more rapidly and get something moving. But
Right.
yeah.
Another question for you. Does ranked choice make a difference based upon how a local government is structured? Like how he mentioned that Albany's mayor is chosen by council members versus in Alameda, we vote directly for the mayor.
Yes, there's no relationship between really the election method and the structure of government. It's a good question, because oftentimes when people hear proportional representation, they think, oh, well, that's a parliamentary system. Because for the most part, countries that use proportional representation have a parliamentary system, so they understandably equate those two together. But in fact, you can have a parliament like in the United Kingdom, but they don't use proportional representation. So the form of your government, the structure of your government, is not controlled by your election method. They're separate from each other.
So the question that I have then, if we have 5 council members now, if we went to district elections, we would not necessarily have 5 districts.
Yeah, and again, that would be a value choice or
Right.
A political choice for Alameda, whether you stuck with directly elected mayor and went to 4 council districts, or whether you went to 5 council districts. I would suggest a city that has had a tradition of a directly elected mayor citywide is probably going to want to stay with a directly elected mayor citywide, because there are issues which actually we're dealing with in Albany, trying to sort out, of having the council itself appoint the mayor on a rotating basis. So Albany up through about 2006 had a sort of a soft policy that the mayor would rotate every year, and the vice mayor would become the mayor, and so on and so forth. And that had been working well for decades. And then for political reasons, that completely blew up after 2006 with really, I would say, both sides, to the extent their sides, violating that principle. And so with three new council members, because we have term limits, so we actually have three members, of which I'm one on the council, are new. We're headed to adopting a hard rotation, which a number of other small cities like Piedmont and I think San Pablo use when they have defined rotation. Basically set up a queue and have a rotation. But what I'm getting at is allowing the mayor to be selected by the council members themselves provides another opportunity for conflict and self-interest in politics that's probably worth avoiding.
Yeah, we have some examples of that in Alameda as well. So Catherine says, I'm not sure I understand the difference between number 2, political minority representation, and number 3, governance matches voters. They both seem to deal with how votes represent minorities in majority positions on issues. Can you explain the difference between the two?
I think, yeah. very astute. And that was brought up by the study group that I was working with, was like, well, aren't these really kind of the same? And I think that's a reasonable perspective, that stability of governance could be viewed as the sum of both majority rule and political minority representation. So it's if you have majority rule, you'll probably have stability of governance, but you'll have a stability of governance where, as I said, the arguments are going to occur in the community and maybe not on the council, whereas I prefer the reverse. The arguments happen on the council, and we all get to get along more to a greater extent that we can. So yeah, I think it's reasonable to look at stability of governance as sort of the sum of those two working well.
Okay. Another question, would ranked choice or district elections result in more people running for office?
Yeah, good question. So that was the number one criteria that our school board, I'm just checking, I don't mean to do this, but my wife is, okay, we're good. So our school board, there's a higher proportion of elections that are uncontested for the school board in Albany than for the city council. I don't know, if there's more candidates for city council typically relative to the number of seats in Alameda than school board. But that is the case in Albany for whatever reason. And so the number one criteria that our school board asked for was more candidates. Give us the method that will get us more candidates, because that's what we need.
Mhm.
And so the Charter Review Committee adopted that as one of, I can't remember, I think 6 criteria that we looked at. And so I ran analyses based on cities that had transitioned from single member districts plurality to single member district ranked choice, which it's not exactly analogous, or not exactly the same, but it's close analogy as I could get to. And to our interest, there was no change in the ratio of candidates to seats available. No change. And then I actually took it on myself to run the same analysis for the comparator cities to Alameda that I came up with to look at the uncontested election. I found the same thing, no change in the ratio of candidates to seats.
Huh.
So as much as you might hope or desire, or as much as that might be a criteria for you, it doesn't appear that the choice of election methods that are available to cities is going to get you there. It's going to take something else.
Hmm.
And there's a variety of something else's that could be, but it's going to take something other than the choice of election method.
Yeah, that kind of goes against, what you would think would occur in district elections. Another question, if the city moves to district elections, aren't many of the same problems simply carried over to a smaller footprint of land?
The same sort of policy problems that are being experienced and not dealt with at an at-large level?
I would think so.
Yeah, it's certainly not going to be I would say a panacea or a magical solution to getting the council to actually take action cohesively and coherently on the problems that face the city. That said, the one economic study that I found that really seems to bear on this question does indicate that it can have an impact on housing policy, which has a direct impact on housing generation. So just to reiterate that, what that study found was by district elections were associated with less housing production than at-large elections. Now that's only one policy domain, so I don't want to, it's easy for us as humans to, overweight what we're looking at, so it may have opposite effects in other policy domains, but that's the one research paper I've seen.
I have 2 more for you, and then we'll end it. There's a comment saying that San Francisco voters went back to district voting to draw more progressive districts to change the balance of power on the Board of Supervisors. This person was on the Supervisor Terrence Hallinan's staff when his colleague Andy Lives championed and personally mapped the city to develop its districts in the fall of 1995. So some history about San Francisco district elections.
I could actually jump in just for a sec on that.
Yeah.
I have heard extensive disgruntlement among progressives in San Francisco that things didn't play out the way they were told they would play out. both going to districts and going to ranked choice. And so I've actually heard various progressives talk against ranked choice and wanting to rescind it for that reason. I don't really have much truck with that because an election method should not be chosen to advantage or disadvantage any particular group. And in that regard, plurality at large, you know, it's, well, this is not the reason it was chosen in Albany or Alameda, to my knowledge, but it is considered the worst method by political scientists, and it was specifically chosen and demonstrably chosen from historical documents across many cities in the South because it would exclude representation for racial minorities.
Mhm. The last question for you, individual said, given my question about district cost to run equalizing less cost, how does land mass affect this? One assumes that size acreage would make a difference.
Yeah, I don't so the process the state has mandated, it really isn't going to scale with size that much. So, you know, there's demographic firms that specialize in consulting to cities for drawing district boundaries. And Alameda would certainly hire one of these firms because I doubt you have the in-house capacity to do the kinds of analyses that are required, which are, you know, very specialized. And those firms, you know, they've developed methodologies and approaches that are the effort of which does not scale with the number of voters. I mean, they put the data in, they run the algorithm, and out comes some answers. And so it really doesn't matter if it's, you know, 100,000 people or 1 million people. Now, maybe it matters a little bit, but it doesn't, it's not a linear relationship. The state process mandates, I think at this point, 3 public workshops. So the first one to introduce the idea, the second one to take public input on different district lines. So anybody can submit a district map. That's a feature that's required. And cities typically provide tools to help people draw district maps so they can draw maps with equal population. And then the third one, I think, is to present some maps back to the public based on what they input and going through demography and the council making some choices, present that back, get some input. And then the fourth meeting is the council adopting it. And I believe all that has to happen within, I don't know, like 130 days to 180 days after the data is available from the census. So, or you choose to go to district elections. So yeah, that cost doesn't really scale that much with the size of the jurisdiction.
Well, thank you. I think as everybody can see, Preston has put a tremendous amount of work into the presentation and actually drawn in a lot of data to really make it very meaningful for us in Alameda. And I think the next task for us is to figure out what, if anything, we want to do. And we look forward to hearing from Alamedans to go to the next step. So Jordan, Preston, thank you so much for an outstanding presentation. And I will turn it over to Susan Hauser, our president.
I'm sorry, thank you. Tomorrow night, we have another presentation at 7 o'clock on a related topic, campaign finances. I hope to see you there. If you haven't already, you may register, I think, on a link that's in the chat box tonight, or you can go to our website, www.lvalameda.org, to not only register for tomorrow night's presentation, but also to find out the many topics that our league is working on. Thank you again for attending and for supporting our league. Good night.